Thank you so much for all of you coming tonight. It's a real pleasure to be talking here with all these wonderful guests. So I hate to be the one to break it, but climate change is here. We are living it now, and unfortunately, this is just the start. I personally have been concerned about climate change for a couple of decades and became more concerned with the birth of my first son, because I felt worried that the world we were creating for him was not the same world that I had enjoyed, the same beautiful, prosperous and safe world. And I'm not the only one feeling this way. Recent polling and the data from our Voices focus groups show that climate change is the #1 issue of concern for the people of Mackellar. I believe for a long while, as many of us did, that our political leaders, the people representing us, would act in our best interests to address climate change. However, that has not been the story of the federal government over the last decade. A few years ago, I was chatting to my then 12-year-old son and his friends. They were asking me about climate change. I said to them, unfortunately, it's going to be an issue that you kids will need to deal with. And this beautiful 12-year-old boy turned around to me with a big smile of eagerness on his face and said, "Yes, because you adults have failed us." So that was the wake-up call. I'd been waiting and I realised it was time to stop waiting and to step up. Little did I know, and in fact I never imagined for a minute, that it would look like this. Many of you also know my story, perhaps, about how I met our local member. At the end of the Black Summer bushfires, when smoke was still thick in the air, I asked him to please speak up on behalf of Mackellar, because there were so many of us that were distressed about the fires and about climate change. And the answer that I heard was, well, the problem is you can't mention the words climate change in the party room because the Queensland MPs jump up and down. And I knew it was time to get involved. I stepped up as I realised our local member did not have the power, the freedom, or the ability to genuinely represent us, the people of Mackellar. Over the past decade, we've seen that our federal government has not only refused to act meaningfully on climate change, but they have repealed and undermined the bodies and policies that would have allowed us to make important transitions and carbon reductions. The current government has also actively campaigned against the rest of the world taking action on climate change, arguing in international forums for reduced targets and weakened international pledges on action and goals. We've had a steady stream of misinformation for decades in support of inaction on climate. First of all, climate change did not exist. Then it did exist, but it wasn't man-made. Then it did exist and it was man-made, but the increasing CO2 levels were actually good for growing food. Climate change does exist, but Australia's contribution is too small to make a difference. Australia is actually a world leader on climate change, and we are meeting and beating our really great 2030 carbon targets. All misinformation. The trillion-dollar question is why? Why, when the science and expert opinion on climate change is irrefutable and has been for a long while now? The IPCC has said that if we want a livable future, we must not open any new coal or gas mines, yet our government continues to approve them and push for more. The UN Secretary-General has said the addiction to fossil fuels is mutually assured destruction. The WHO has said that climate change is the greatest threat to human health. Former Australian Defence Chiefs have come together to warn us that climate change is the biggest security risk to Australia and a risk to our future. They have revealed how they were silenced and prohibited from speaking openly about climate change. They warn that we will be at the forefront of the impacts of climate change, and we currently have no plan to deal with it. Former emergency leaders, thank you, Greg. You were really a shining light for us during the Black Summer bushfires. As you heard and you know, Greg and his group of former emergency leaders tried to warn our government about the impending mega fires that we were at risk of, and they were ignored and dismissed, despite trying for 18 months, was it, Greg?
We're still
trying. Still trying, years. The Business Council of Australia, a conservative body representing over 100 of Australia's biggest corporations, also warns that unless we get ahead of the global transition away from fossil fuel dependency, then we will be left behind and it will be incredibly difficult to catch up. They warn that we will not be able to maintain our current standard of living if we do not urgently diversify our economy into the renewable, high-tech, clean energy sector. The Business Council of Australia also states that we've already missed out on billions of dollars in investment because we have been too slow to act and because of the uncertainty around policy and targets from our government. Just a couple of weeks ago in the budget, the government reduced funding to our key climate change and renewable energy agencies, which some of our panellists have worked on, including the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. Funding was reduced by 35% over the next 4 years. Probably the one thing that I find most difficult to comprehend is that just a few months ago, the Morrison government fought and won a federal court case against a group of teenagers and young people. They argued successfully that the government should not be held to have a duty of care to the children of Australia. And this is despite almost certain significant harms to their health caused by ongoing use and investment in fossil fuels. How can we accept that as our reality? All I can say is thank goodness for the people that are on the stage and the many thousands like them around Australia who are leading the way on renewables and on climate change. We know that Australia can be a world leader on climate change, and we can put ourselves in a position to be a clean energy superpower. We know the solutions exist and we'll hear about them tonight, but what is missing is the political, not just the political will, but the political leadership. With all of this in mind, as the member for Mackellar, I will work towards tackling climate change and help Australia to become a renewable superpower. We're going to be releasing our full policy in a few days, but just now as a summary, I'll do that by legislating a minimum 50% emissions reduction target by 2030 in line with the Business Council of Australia and all the states. By stopping new coal, oil and gas developments. By establishing an independent climate change commission to advise and make recommendations to the government, similar to how the Reserve Bank of Australia works. By supporting Australia's electricity market regulator to deliver at least 80% renewable energy by 2030. The agency has identified that this is entirely doable. By making Australia a renewable energy superpower with a plan and policies that support an orderly and just transition to a net zero economy. By making electric vehicles and renewable energy accessible to everyday Australians. By developing long-term adaptation strategies to protect our infrastructure, supply chains and communities from the impacts of climate change. By providing federal funding to build the capacity to provide rapid and coordinated disaster relief for communities suffering extreme weather disasters. And by investing in Australia's natural capital by regenerating and replanting our nation's forests and countrysides. So there will be more published on the website soon, but now we'll get on with the panel discussion, which I'm sure will be very exciting. Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg, Kat and Martine, for joining us tonight. It's really exciting to have you here. Greg, I'll start with you. As a local and an RFS volunteer and somebody who's grown up in the area, we're always very keen to hear from you. We'd love to hear about a bit about your background and growing up here and working as a first responder. We'd also like to hear about what you've been experiencing and observing in recent months and years.
Oh, is it working? It is. Yeah, thanks, Sophie. And welcome, everybody. Great to be here. I grew up in Terrey Hills, and I'm about to move back into the house that my mum and dad built, actually, and we've rebuilt it, so which is very exciting. Moved in when I came out of Manly Hospital, and 63 years ago, and I'll be moving back in on my birthday. So there, go figure. But living in Terrey Hills, I grew up with bushfires. We were over the road from the fire station, or fire shed that fell down because white ants ate it. But and Dad was a volunteer firefighter, so it was in my blood from an early age. Mum knew the bush. She knew the botanical and common names of every plant and tree. She knew the Indigenous history of the area. So I have a deep love for this area, born and bred. But I started fighting fires from age 12. My first fire was in 1971. There was a big fire came through from Duffys Forest. And I've been through, I remember the 1968 fire that came through, which was a big one. 1979, I fought that fire. About 14 homes were destroyed. And then 1994, we lost about 35 homes, I think, locally. But look, the trajectory, I had a career in Fire and Rescue New South Wales for 39 years and then rejoined as a volunteer. I'm now Deputy Group Captain with the local RFS, and there's some colleagues here tonight and people I went to school with, so great to see you. This is a beautiful area, but it's a very vulnerable area. And what I've watched over the years, and who's read my book? Anyone read my book? But yeah, read my book. But I watched as the weather changed over that 50 years, and Dad would read the bush, he'd read the weather, and he'd say, no, this year's not going to be the big one. We'll get some big fires, but they won't be that bad. Oh, and he always picked the bad years. 1994, he and the other old timers just didn't pick it because it rained in November, and that's when we'd write off the fire season and say, yep, good, we'll get through the hot space over Christmas, January, we'll be okay. But no, it got suddenly dry, suddenly hot. And look, in a nutshell, the weather had changed, and it hasn't gone back. It's got worse since then. So, and weather over a long time is your climate. So I started to read, and I went overseas. I got a Churchill Fellowship that allowed me to study bushfires in France, Spain, Canada, the US for some months. And wherever I went in the world, firefighters were saying, it's getting worse and we don't know why. We've got better technology, better firefighting technologies and arrangements and more resources, but we're losing. And so here, Dad had said, look, about every 10 or 11 years, they're the weather patterns. That's when you get the bad weather here in the Blue Mountains. So we got through to 94, thought, yep, we've got a decade. 1997, we were losing homes again. 2001, Christmas Eve, and then Christmas Day, losing homes. 2002, 2003, Canberra. I think it was the first recorded fire tornado in history in the world. And there's a doctor here of fire science who'll probably grab me afterwards, say it was the third one or something, but sorry, Simon. I'm doing my best. And then 2009, Black Saturday, everything changed. We had to change the fire danger rating system. So look, I'm worried about the Northern Beaches. We haven't had a big fire since 1994. We had some in 2003, but they weren't huge. We're long overdue. Rain is a double-edged sword. It stops the fires, but it stops you doing hazard reduction burning, and it makes the growth just take off. So big picture, we have to dial the heat down. The temperature's going up. It's changed the weather patterns. It's hotter, drier. The droughts are worse, and that makes the fire intensity far higher. And we could be decimated here. The fire in 94 was magnitudes worse than the 79 fire, which was worse than the 68 fire. I hate to think what our next mega fire will look like on the northern beaches. We have a lot of vulnerable people who've never been through a big fire. So that's one of the things that drives me. But the big thing that drives me is my grandkids. And Sophie, as you said, I was fighting fires on New Year's Eve at Bateman's Bay, and I saw things I'd never seen before, and kangaroos dying in circumstances I'd never seen before, which really affected me. And I realised my grandkids aren't going to see the wildlife that I saw when my parents took me camping as a kid. And the environment's changing, and it's because of us, so we have to fix it.
Greg, you were really, especially during the Black Summer bushfires, a shining light in the dark. A lot of us think that. Could you share for us your first-hand experience of interacting with the government when you were trying to warn them about the coming fires?
So I'll try and be nice. Look, it was incredible. So you had 23 former fire and emergency chiefs from every fire service in Australia, from every state and territory, who were willing to sit down with the Prime Minister and say, look, Prime Minister, there's a disaster coming your way. This was in April and May 2019. We'd seen the 2018 fires in Tasmania and Queensland and Northern Tablelands of New South Wales. I fought those fires in February and March in the Northern Tablelands, and it wasn't right. It was just wrong. It was all not right. And the drought, which had been a fairly short drought, was just worsening and worsening. And it's because 1.4 degree average increase in temperature night and day, more evaporation. So the fuels were dying, the living fuel. So we knew there was this catastrophe. So you'd think if a group of experts offered their expertise, a responsible leader would say, yep, want to speak to you. But no, we were personally attacked, particularly Commissioner Lee Johnson from Queensland, me, personal attacks by certain part of the media that was beholden to the Morrison government, and the Prime Minister attacked us personally, which was very odd. Until there was media pressure in September, they didn't want to know about us, and we were offered a meeting with Angus Taylor. Anyway, we had a meeting eventually in December. By then, hundreds and hundreds of homes had been destroyed, people had lost their lives, and it was just too late to get extra aircraft to work out how to use the Defence Forces more easily. So it was an immensely frustrating time, and in between I was going to fires. I was all over the state going to fires, and it was an incredibly exhausting time, but we called a National Bushfire Summit because there was just this total leadership vacuum. And the other thing that happened was the denial and the lies, and I'll say the lies. It's arsonists. Well, no, the figures say there was less arson during Black Summer than a normal year. The police figures, New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria, a testament to that. It's because of the greenies stopping back burning, and that's the wrong term, by the way, Barnaby. And that was just a lie. There's been more hazard reduction burning, and the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry found no, it wasn't an issue. It was the weather. It was a weather-driven event. It was the hottest, driest year ever recorded. That drove the fires, and it drove fire behaviour we've never seen before. And look, they still don't listen. We had a group yesterday, the security leaders, diplomats and ambassadors, Public Health Association of Australia, former chief veterinary officers and emergency leaders have written to both Mr Albanese and Mr Morrison saying, happy to meet, but you need to mobilise Australia to reach net zero as soon as possible, because we're going to a very, very bad place, but we could go to a very, very good place with leadership, and there's none.
Thank you, Greg. So in my introduction, I talked a bit about misinformation around climate change, and I'd like to address this. So Kat and Martine, There's often a narrative in the media, the dominant narrative is that Australia needs to choose between action on climate change and economic prosperity. And I'd love to hear your point of view from both of you on this issue. Kat, you start. Ladies first.
There we go. And thank you, everyone. It's lovely to be here. And I wanted to start as well to pay my respects and to also, like Greg, say that I grew up here as well. And I think that it was really, I was going to follow a profession like yours into medicine, Sophie, but my father, who we lived at Newport, and I live there now, used to always look out at the coal boats that you can see even today on the horizon, lining up for either Newcastle or Wollongong, waiting and say, you know, those boats are going to ruin our paradise here. And that really changed everything for me. And so I didn't go into medicine. I went into photovoltaics, and here I am. And I'm really grateful for that, because although that threat is omnipresent and terrifying, especially now after the floods and the fires, I have been privy to the opportunity that this nation has in terms of becoming a renewable energy superpower. I trained as a photovoltaic engineer. I've worked in Australia and internationally with the best engineers and economists and investors looking at how the globe is going to transform. And Australia is this beautiful, and I don't mean to undermine us, but petri dish of how the world could be if we embrace this opportunity. We have the opportunity not just to power our whole nation, but perhaps our whole region if we become 700% renewables, which we have more than enough opportunity to do within the next 10 to 15 years. And that will affect every part of our life, everything that we do in our home. It will democratise energy, it will democratise our transport system, and it will aid the democratisation and equality of our nation and the region. And so it is terrifying, but the opportunity is so wonderful that it's also very exciting.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you.
So thanks very much for being here. I'm not from this electorate, I'm from Zali's electorate, so just down the street, and I'm hoping that Sophie follows in the success that we had down there. I think that from my perspective, there's this obsession that action on climate change is all about moving backwards, whereas in fact, the whole point of setting aggressive targets on climate change and action is so that you can actually drive change. And when we introduced mobile phones, I don't think many people went and defended the fax machine. And when we introduced streaming, not many people are defending DVDs and videos. So if people are saying there's this incredible opportunity to transform our economy, then we should be thinking about the opportunity and giving us a stretch target to win and to get there and to really change the economy. So at the moment, as you heard, I'm chairing the Victorian government's panel on setting a target for 2035. So Victoria has the most progressive piece of legislation in the world on climate change. It sets very aggressive targets over periods, and we're going through a public consultation at the very start of the process, but they have quite an aggressive target for 2030 in the which the panel recommended, and now they're looking at 2035. The UK last week put out a 79% target of emission reductions by 2035. And we've also seen the ACT for 2040, I think it is, have a close to 98% target. So we've got people who are pushing targets out there because they say this is a way to signal to the economy that the economy can change and move fast. So the whole narrative that we get from government about this is really bad and we can't do this because it will hurt the economy is simply wrong. And the great irony here is, as you said, Sophie, everyone in Australia, the Business Council, the state governments, are pushing, even Labor are pushing quite aggressive targets for 2030, but the government's well behind that. So we need to reframe this debate in a way that's all about where we can go to. The second thing is It's easy to get depressed in Australia, but we are probably one of the countries that's the furthest behind in terms of vision on this, because, as Greg said, there's no leadership. So when you go overseas, you see many other governments taking real leadership, and it's just a different narrative, and it's not a political issue as it is here. It's more of an economic issue. And finally, the other point I just make is that change is happening so fast. So everything, the number of times I've had conversations in various government roles with politicians who say, on both sides of government, that cannot be done. And I'm saying, but it's already being done in Brisbane. It's already being done in Melbourne. I say, oh, that's not possible. I say, but it is being done. And so as Kat knows through the work with CFC and Arena, a few years ago, there was a effort to introduce large-scale solar into Australia. And everybody said, look, it was too expensive, it wasn't possible to do. But the problem was no one in Australia had really done it. So when Arena went out and invited people to come and bid for large-scale solar, what happened was a lot of the international players with deep experience of that came to Australia. The foreign banks said, we'll lend money for 15 years. They said that they had contractors who knew how to build these facilities, and the cost came down, it came down, 5-6 times immediately. So by bringing experience internationally and then by applying it in Australia, there's real opportunities here. And I think people just underestimate how fast things will happen. And I know from the work that we're doing in Victoria, if things happen in a certain way and the private sector decides to do certain things like shut down coal plants, which Origin are already looking at doing, and others, AGL, etc., are closing some plants early and bringing that forward, and we have this massive inflow of offshore wind, which many companies have been planning for 5 years, 10 years to do offshore wind in Australia, that will fundamentally change the energy grid. And it's interesting, people are already saying offshore wind's too hard and too expensive, but we've got 5 private companies beginning to build massive offshore wind in Victoria. So these transitions are happening, they're going to happen, they're going to happen much faster than we think, and we've got to frame this as a fundamental opportunity to transform our economy.
Thank you. It is exciting, and thank goodness for the state leaders as well. We are getting somewhere. It's great. So the IPC says it's not too late. We still have a window of opportunity with all, for all these wonderful things ahead that can happen. Can you just let us know, are we actually meeting and beating our 2030 targets as we're told that we are, that were set in 2015?
Look, and what a target, 26 to 28%, I think is we might make 30. Better not say, that's better. Look, now you can hear me. So the target for a start was abysmal, and compared to what the states are doing. And it's really fascinating to me, the Morrison government talks about small government. Well, careful what you wish for, because industry and business is saying, well, no, we know where the dollars are, and sorry, we're going to close the coal plants, etc., because there's not going to be any money in that. So interesting, but so the one that really upsets me, I suppose, is 20% reduction. And so let's dig into that. That's supposedly because of what's been absorbed by trees that they haven't cut down. And I think the actual figure is, so there's no policy to actually reduce emissions. And I think the figures are, if you take that away, it's gone up by 7%. So the government's asleep at the wheel. And again, and my background, I'm pretty, it's sort of uniform service and command and control. And I know what leadership looks like in a crisis when people are going to lose their lives. And I have to admit I have contempt for this current government because I've watched the total lack of leadership. And
so when you set a target and when you want to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, you need something to achieve that target. So at the moment, we're basically relying on the private sector to do things, and we're providing a little bit of funding through organisations like Arena and CFC to fund and drive change. But let's be very clear, we have no significant piece of legislation or policy in Australia on industry to reduce their emissions. The Labor Party introduced an emissions trading scheme. Tony Abbott dismantled it. Greg Hunt, to his credit, introduced another piece of legislation called the Safeguard Mechanism, which does cap industry emissions, but the levels are set so low that it's pretty much ineffective. So as Greg says, it doesn't actually achieve much. And Labor's policy is to make that into proper targets. But at the moment, we have no mechanism of any substance to cap industry emissions. We have a scheme to buy offsets, which the government is going to defund $1 billion. We have the organisations, as you mentioned, that are funding this change being slightly defunded. And so there is no real policy on climate. And we have a target that is bloody appalling. And the fact is, every other state in Australia, every other state government has far more aggressive targets and are putting in policies. So we have this really interesting sort of, position where, similar to COVID, the states are leading on the issues, not the federal government. And so it is a real issue, and it's very, very challenging, and we need to have proper policy. We need to have policy on electric vehicles and targets so that industry can invest, and investors like to have this sort of certainty about what's going to happen. And so I think one of the challenges really, we need to have a comprehensive climate policy. It needs to be tailored to economic policy, and we need to have clear signals so the market can invest. But at the moment, the hard truth of it, no matter how you want to shape it, is that policy simply does not exist.
Kat, just coming to you, you've worked at the government agency responsible for funding renewables projects. What's your opinion on the government's approach to this funding the projects?
Thanks, Sophie. So I did work with Martijn at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And, I think, I should say that institution, the fact that we have it is incredible. It was put in place by a government when no other economy had basically a government green bank like it, except the UK. It ended up being much bigger than the UK equivalent, which got bought by Macquarie, so now no longer exists. We have a fabulous mechanism to support the cutting edge of renewables in Australia in the CFC arena. And it's been recognised globally as best practice. And yet this government is defunding it. It's doing everything in its toolkit to take us backwards. And it's really sad because that organisation, or those two organisations, have really done more work than, in my view, all the other things put together that government has done. And so we have, and as Martijn suggested, we've got mechanisms in place to be and to do really brilliant things. It doesn't, take much effort, but they're actually doing the opposite, which is really disappointing.
So to come back to the story about CFC, so as many of you know, out of the negotiations between Julia Gillard and Christine Milne, who was then leader of the Greens, there was this agreement when Greg Conway was minister to set up the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. It was set up. I was one of the founding directors on that organisation. 6 months later, there was an election, and this is on the public record, and it was reported extensively in the Australian. In the election, in this caretaker period before the election, all the directors got a letter from Andrew Robb, and I think it was co-signed, I can't remember who co-signed it, but I've got it at home, which said, if each of you directors on the CFC, we're going to wind you up when we get elected, and if you invest in any project, we're going to personally hold you liable as directors. To which all the directors of the CFC said, well, I'm sorry, but we have a statutory obligation to fulfil the obligations of this organisation, and off we went. They passed legislation numerous times to repeal the CFC. That was unsuccessful, and from there the CFC went on. As Kat said, it is one of the most successful and highly regarded organisations in the world that a lot of people look to about driving investment in renewables. But it just shows you, the point I'm trying to make here is that the climate debate in Australia is very much ideological, right? So there are many in the Liberal Party who are very supportive of climate action and drive that and are very strong advocates of that. But I think there are many others, as you said, in the Queensland coal seats who who push back on that. And so there is a problem with, we need to get this out of ideology, we need to get it out of politics, and we just need to make it a problem that we all collectively need to deal with, and it shouldn't be a political issue.
Thanks, Martijn. We did see that, didn't we, that bipartisanship at the start of the COVID pandemic, and wow, didn't it give us all hope that we might actually get some action on climate change as well? So, Martijn, what are we doing right? Where do we need to invest, and what actually are the opportunities for Australia?
Interesting things about Australia is we have a very complicated, Kat's going to know exactly what I'm saying, energy system in Australia. I mean, we built an energy system with large coal and gas plants, large transmission lines, which service cities, and everyone in Australia expects the lights to be on all the time. And so one of the concerns of government, and it is a genuine concern, is when you're transitioning that system away from that old style to renewables and using solar and wind and then now batteries, how do you keep that system stable? And so when the federal government and the opposition and others talk about the need to have a stable, reliable energy system, that is a very important objective. However, what often doesn't get talked about is there are solutions to do that. So we're seeing large amounts of investment in solar, large amounts of investment in wind, large amounts of investment in batteries. And the technologies of all of this is accelerating all the time. And then the combination of those coming together, we need to build more transmission lines. But the focus has to be on, firstly, on our energy system, on decarbonising the entire energy system. And we are on track to do that. And I think, as I think you said, Greg, many of the owners of those older plants, like coal plants, are saying, well, they're not really that economic to run they come to an end of life. They're not really economic to run anymore. We're going to shut them down. And that's why we've got to find ways to stabilise the system. But there are a lot of, the numbers that I've seen in a lot of the states in Australia is if you close those coal power stations and you ramp up renewables and you look at hydrogen and you look at batteries and you look at offshore wind, there's a tremendous amount to be an international exporter of renewable energy as opposed to just worrying about supplying our own needs. Secondly, transport. Transport's a really important sector. And the move is on. Electric vehicles are now starting to, the question is building them fast enough, but there's an increase in uptake in Australia of electric vehicles. There's more types of electric vehicles will become available, and that's a really important thing, and more charging networks, etc. But we're a long way behind. I was in London the week before last, and every telegraph pole, you can just plug in your car and charge it just about. But here we don't have that yet, so that we've got to build that infrastructure. It is coming. We're building it. And the more policy signals there are about setting targets, the quicker that we'll have. In agriculture, there's a lot of talk about getting emissions down. There is a lot of new things about how you feed cattle with different feedstocks like seaweed and asparagopolis, and using that to reduce emissions. In aviation, there's a whole move on to do that as well. In all of the sectors of the economy, there are really good solutions to drive fundamental change and bring emissions down. And so I think we have this opportunity to do that. And the building blocks are there, and there's really a bit of a race on internationally as to who's going to be the key leader in green steel, who will be the key leader in green aluminium, who's going to lead on all these other things. And the other interesting thing about at the moment with Ukraine and the war in Europe, it's pushing this need for people to realise they need to be more have greater energy security and reliability, and not to rely just on other countries. One of the challenges there also is that Ukraine has a lot of critical minerals, and a lot of those critical minerals are critical to building solar and wind. But we're also seeing now as people exploring what are the alternatives to minerals to make batteries and to make solar panels. And so we're going to see this constant evolution of technology, which tends to happen in step change, but things do happen, and I think it's pretty exciting. I mean, you can print solar panels on a 3D printer. You've got wind turbines that are like sticks and just do that now and generate electricity. There's new forms of batteries coming out. It's really exciting what is happening. And I think with supporting that R&D, supporting that innovation, getting our super funds to support that is really critical.
So I totally agree, of course. But I just wanted to reiterate the other things that we have, and how lucky we are. We are under, normally, a beautiful sunny nation. We have more renewable energy opportunities here than most nations put together in some cases. We also have amazing minerals. We have many of the rare earths and lithium that you need to build the batteries that we're going to need, as well as the renewable energy. We also have the brains, and this is something I don't think people talk about enough. I work a lot with international investors, and they want to invest in Australia because we have the smartest people, we have the most activists who care about climate, we have the highest disposable income per household spent on the energy transition, on our own renewables, on our own electric vehicles. We have amazing innovation. Even in this electorate, we have clean tech startups and growth businesses. We have activist organisations. We have the fundamentals to make sure that we are prosperous from this transition. And what that means at a household level is, all the modelling shows that electrifying our economy means every household will be $5,000 better off per annum once we are electrified. It means those industries that we are creating in the electrification journey will employ at least 3 times what our current fossil fuel industries are employing in terms of people. So we are providing the opportunities and the ability for us all to be prosperous if we can lean into the amazing gifts that we have been given here. And I think people don't realise how personal that can be for us, but also for our whole country.
It is exciting, thank you. Kat, you are head of investment in Mike Cannon-Brookes' company, Boundless. I'm sure everyone here would be really keen to hear what's going on. What are you looking at?
So I should reiterate, I'm here in my own personal capacity tonight. But I have decided to join Mike recently. I'm a month in, because of his really ambitious approach to climate and climate investing. I think Mike, like many of us here, is, just an Aussie guy who really wants to see catalytic and transformative change in this country, and has already seen how it can create opportunities and prosperity, and a new national identity for all of us that is beyond sort of our old sort of lump of coal view of the world, and towards an exciting and democratic and prosperous view of the world. So in terms of, what are we looking at? We're looking across all sectors. So we're really focused on electrifying everything. If you've had a chance to read Saul Griffith's new Big Switch, that is 100% the type of thing that we're looking at. We're looking to electrify our own country. Mike's already invested in SunDrive, a solar business. He's invested in a solar financing business, Bright, that allows lower cost finance for all of us to get solar. He's invested in Sun Cable, which is looking to take our solar to our nearest neighbours so we can not just power Australia but the world. We're looking at transport, we're looking at fugitives, we're looking to help our big, heavy industries transition to hydrogen and other alternative fuels, to get steel and iron to be green, urea. All of these things we're actually really good at already. We just need to add the smarts of renewables to make them way better. And he wants, like so many of us, to just work with the amazing people that are already in the space, the state governments, some people in the federal government, and many of the other brilliant entrepreneurs and activist groups to make this quicker and faster and bigger and more wonderful than it already is. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. The other really interesting thing about this also is that, like, Mike's been a real advocate of electrification. There are many others that are real advocates of hydrogen. And so everyone has a slightly different view on the way to get there, but everyone's exploring many different options. And they're all, so we've got the point I'm making, there's many options on the table, and some will fail and some will be successful and some will be really exciting and some will be, terrifying. But at the end of the day, there's so much work going on all these different things that, that's also hope that why we're going to get there.
There's certainly a lot of things to be hopeful about. It's fantastic. Thank you. We've been talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there's another side to things as well, and that's how we adapt and how we prepare for the changing climate. Greg, why hasn't this been done in Australia so well, and what do we need to do to ensure our infrastructure, our supply chains and our communities are resilient in the future?
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, that's a really big question, and why, and I think we've heard why. Big picture, there's been not just a reduction in budgets, but stopping innovation and not moving. The same things happened in the emergency management sector. And the Productivity Commission found that 97% of expenditure is after a disaster and only 3% before. Now, there's a thing called the Sendai Disaster Risk Reduction Framework that Australia signed up to 2015 to 2030. We build back better. There's a whole lot of principles, but we're not complying with our obligations under that agreement and framework. And we should be investing in making communities more resilient. What does that mean? Resilience means taking a hit and having the ability to bounce back. Now, the emergency services are overwhelmed, and I often say they're resourced for the threat environment of the 1990s, not the 21st century with worsening extreme weather. And just to give you a taste, and I know I'm a bit of a I sound like I'm doom and gloom, but it's actually fixable. All this is fixable. But one study says on current warming trajectory, the weather we experienced in Black Summer will be average by 2040. So that means an average bushfire season will look like Black Summer. I'd hate to see what a bad one looks like. And by 2060, that'll be exceedingly cool. So Black Summer will be a walk in the park. But what that means is ecosystem change. So we must do something. So how do you survive that? It's about hardening infrastructure, microgrids. When I was in Bateman's Bay on New Year's Eve, we lost power. And so they lost water pumping stations, sewage, refrigeration, mobile phone towers. So we couldn't get emergency alerts. And we were relying on electronic maps, so we didn't know where we were. So we just sort of drove towards the smoke, which was everywhere, which was quite difficult. So everything falls over, and that's where the investment needs to be. But we need to move some communities. And we saw with the floods. So the Lismore floods smashed I think it was 1974, and I can't remember the peaks, but I think it was 12.7 metres, it was 14.1, I think, the peak. You don't smash flood records by that much naturally. That it's by millimetres or centimetres, but that was by metres. And that's because 1 degree of warming equals 7% more moisture in the atmosphere and more violent downpours. And when you get a La Nina, it's not that intense a La Nina, but look what's happened. So our threat environment has changed. We must get ahead. And again, it's a lack of leadership. The National Recovery and Resilience Authority or Agency was formed, $4.8 billion. It should be going to flood mitigation, and I think they got 180 million or something out the door, and people are living in tents down where I fought fires on New Year's Eve 2019. So that's pretty sad, and that's, again, a failure of government once again. So I know I keep hammering this, but I want to see leadership in this country that I love because I've seen it before.
So just add to that, I don't think Australia is alone on this issue. So I think adaptation and resilience is a global problem. I think many people just do not invest in it. The problem is it is seen as a cost, not as an investment. So we need to think that all those power lines that were burned in the bushfires, you should build them back underground, not back in the same place that they burnt through the national park. Lismore shouldn't be where it is, and we should move it. We should do different things. So we've got to think about, and the great irony is insurance companies are saying, well, we know this is going to happen again, so we're not going to insure you. right? Because it's a risk to us. And so anyone who's involved in planning should be saying, well, what are the risks? What do we need to invest in? Because over the long term, it will cost us a lot less. And I just think that's I mean, there are unfortunately very few countries that actually addressing this properly.
Thank you all. I think what we might do now is open up for some questions, give you a chance to have your say as well. Thanks, Sanyo. Got a bit of battery.
Thank you. Thank you for putting on a great evening, and it's been wonderful to listen to all the panellists. My name's Kurt Smith. I'm the CEO of an ethical and sustainable super fund that is opening up and founded on the Northern Beaches. So we're, thank you, in Mackellar as well. And similar to you, Sophie, one of the drivers for me to do that many years ago was the birth of my son and wanting to create a better world for him. And enough about me. So what role do you see carbon pricing playing in getting to a net zero position and beyond? Because we've heard a lot about how we're transitioning energy and electrifying, which are great, but there's also the things to consider, which is behaviours. So but how do we encourage better behaviours, and how do we transition to that in the future?
Thank you. It's an excellent question and really pertinent. And I should admit, I'm a huge fan of, I did my master's and PhD in climate economics, so I'm a big fan of carbon pricing. It has obviously been very contentious in Australia. There are a few things that we can do. As Martine alluded to, we do have a safeguard mechanism which is voluntary at the moment. If we make that mandatory, the top 100 companies in Australia will be held to account for their emissions reduction, and we'll have to start including a carbon price, not as a shadow carbon price, which most of them do, by the way, already, but as an actual carbon price in their investment decision-making processes. And that can be extended to the rest of the economy. It would be an excellent reform. As Martine also alluded to, Australia hasn't had an environmental economic reform package fully implemented for over 20 years. There are brilliant economic policies that we can put in that do not cause excessive harm, will cause overall prosperity. Carbon pricing is one of them. So I do hope that if we have independents holding our whatever government we have to account, that we can start to objectively look at the full suite of economic policies that can incentivise the whole economy to transition, and that's certainly one of them.
So the really simple answer to the question on carbon pricing is just look at the evidence. Over 100 countries in the world, well over 100 countries, have some sort of carbon price or carbon tax or emissions trading scheme. That's number one. Number two, when we had it in Australia, our emissions fall significantly. The safeguard mechanism, which Kat and I are talking about, is actually, it is compulsory at the moment, but it's not effective because they don't set an obligation on anybody but 10 companies, and it's very low. So, but the voluntary scheme Kat's talking about is another scheme to offset in Australia, which is a voluntary program, and that's just because companies want to do a little bit of action. So as Kat and I are saying, there's nothing driving that change. If we had and again, when the CPRS, which the government called it, the Carbon Price Reduction Scheme, was in place, it drove Australia's emissions down. The evidence is like that. And then when it got removed, it went up again. So you need to tell people if they want to pollute the planet, they have to pay to do that, and they should stop doing it. It's pretty simple. It's not that difficult, right? So the evidence is there, and we should have some sort of carbon pricing system. And it's not. And most of the companies actually are asking for it. So this is the great irony, is that we get told it's a terrible thing, and really it was just a political tactic that Abbott used. It was not really a considered economic policy approach. It was just destroying what was good policy.
Thanks very much. Well, congratulations to our team tonight, because we're so fortunate to have a great team and show the leadership. But I just want to make a comment. A couple of years ago, I attended, it was put on by Randwick Council, and I just want to make a point. The guest speaker was Dr. Carl Kruseniewski. Now, Dr. Carl's a scientist and author, and he said that climate change is not something of of a new event, and he mentioned the word latte sipping lefties, and I thought he was talking about me. But he said, he made the clear point, he said it's been around, and he made the point in the Cold War in the 60s, both the US and the Soviet Union with their submarines realised through climate change that the ice cap and the Arctic pole was melting. So they had to adjust and reassess the submarine's capacity to rise up through the fact that there was so much less ice around. And he said, yeah, the question, but what he was saying, yeah, it's a statement, but what he was saying, again, like Greg and Kat and Martina saying, we've known about it, it's nothing new, lack of leadership, total lack of leadership. And that was some years ago. The other point, my son lives on the north coast and he's heavily involved in koala rescue, and Greg is a living legend because they keep saying to me, why didn't they listen to the fireys and Greg? So I'm at a loss to understand why there was so much good evidence presented to Morrison and the team. Why the hell didn't they listen, is my question.
Can I answer that on your behalf? So I hate to say this, the answer to those two questions is really simple. Those who don't believe in climate change argue it's always occurred. What they ignore is the fact that we are rapidly accelerating it and we are screwing up the planet because of all the shit we're putting in the atmosphere. It's not that complicated, right? But all the climate deniers say it's always been that way. There's always changing in climate. But we are accelerating in the last 50 to 100 years a 4-degree increase on top of that natural increase. And if we don't get that down, we're going to absolutely destroy the planet. That's the first point. The second point about why don't they listen is because there are a group of people in the current government that are ideologically opposed to climate change. This has nothing to do with whether it's good policy or bad policy. They're just worried about numbers of seats in Queensland that they may lose, and therefore in the party room, you don't have those more climate-friendly Liberals advocating very hard for good climate policy. And so it's just, we had this event the other night at Bukacino. Some of you, I don't know if anyone was there, and the question was asked about the same issue about, well, is the government just not so keen on policy? It is an ideological issue that those who don't believe in it, or if they do believe in it, Barnaby Joyce is still saying, until very recently, he doesn't believe in climate change. And so it is an ideological issue, and that is the problem.
Is actually why we need to make this a swing seat or an independent seat, because the seats that have been listened to who are dictating policy are the swing seats, and they've been recently mining seats, and so that's why we've got Barnaby and the other Nationals dictating the agenda and the vote. I mean, we saw what happened even with the 2050 target. It came down to the Nationals. So what's happening with the independent movement, community-backed independence, is that we're making ourselves swing seats. We're making it so that we are listened to. Every single electorate deserves to be heard, including ours. We deserve to have our voice and our values heard in Canberra. So that's what we're doing.
I just want to say something really quickly. I think it was about 1969, my brother got called up to go to fight in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, which terrified me and our family. And I remember saying to Mum and Dad, why are we sending people to Vietnam? She said, because the government's blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, can't we change the government? And they said, not here, because there will always be a Liberal member and they're the government. And in a seat like ours, it doesn't matter how you vote, it won't make a difference. Let's make it make a difference.
Hello, I'm a local resident, live in Warriewood. My name is Ross Fraser. I come here tonight, I'm agnostic with respect to climate change, and so a lot of you probably disagree with me from the start, but I'm here to be in part convinced. I hear Martine saying it's an ideological view that people oppose climate change. Well, I'd say I've heard as many who adopt an ideological view who support climate change. And that, so it doesn't swing me away from my agnosticism. I understand why corporates are really excited about this, because that means money in the bank. But I know who's going to pay. It's the people of Australia. I would ask you, if there wasn't any climate change driver, is there an economic advantage in shifting to photovoltaics or hydrogen or even nuclear?
I'm happy to start. So, and obviously I'm biased, so I'm going to put that up front. I was a renewable energy engineer, but it actually has nothing to do with that now. It is purely about the economics. AGL and Origin are moving to close their coal-fired power stations early because they're losing money. There is not a financier in Australia anymore who will finance a coal-fired power station. They will only be financing renewables because it makes them money. It makes economic sense. So you're right, it is about corporates and Australians and businesses and householders making choices that are in their financial best interest. We're lucky now, and it wasn't always the case. When I started my education, it wasn't, renewables weren't cheaper, but now they absolutely are cheaper, both here and in almost every nation on earth now. It's the cheaper way to access your electricity in a levelised cost form. So it's absolutely an economic decision. It also happens to be a really good one if you are interested in the climate argument.
So when I refer to, I guess, ideology, what I'm saying is there are many on both sides of politics who believe and support action on climate change. There are certain people who have been against action because they just simply see it as a good political manoeuvre which is in their interests. But this all comes back to the very beginning, which is the science. And I sit in a lot of meetings where I get briefed by scientists who illustrate how bad climate change is, how fast it's happening, and the evidence is, I mean, it's very clear. It's there. There's no, if you believe in the science, and I'm sure if you went to Sophie as your doctor and she told you why you were sick, you'd probably believe her. So it's, to me, as someone who sits on government panels at the moment, I'm seeing this panel, as I said before, the Victorian government. We're being briefed by the top scientists in Australia and overseas as to what's going to happen, and if we don't take action on climate, what that will mean for our environment, our economy, our nature, and all the issues that Greg's raised about bushfires and what destruction that does. So for me, everything Kat said is absolutely spot on. And again, you know, all the investors that we work with are not interested in investing in the old forms of energy because they're uneconomic. They want to invest in this. And so for Australia, as Kat said before, to come back to the point about economics, we have the most sun in the world. We have great water supplies. We have incredible opportunity to generate hydrogen, incredible opportunity to generate renewable energy. We've got Mike Cannon-Brooks, who's building a massive renewable energy facility in Northern Australia and shipping that to Singapore because they want to get off oil and gas and want to be energy reliant. We've got Andrew Forrest, we've got others building massive hydrogen facilities to make green hydrogen out of solar and water and export that to Japan for their cars, to South Korea, to elsewhere around the world. So we have ability to do all that. And then if we can generate a lot more energy through renewable energy, which basically the fuel source for renewables is free. It's the sun. Whereas if you want, and the wind, if you want to build a new coal power station, it costs an enormous amount of money to build. It takes you 20 years to get your money back. It pollutes a lot of the environment, has a large contamination cost. And in addition to that, you then got to charge a lot of money to get that back over the long term. And you've got to dig the coal out of the ground. If you do solar, you can build it the same amount of energy in 6 months, get as much power, and then you can basically, the energy cost can significantly come down. It also means if we have more energy than we need, we can start to do more manufacturing in Australia. So we've lost all our manufacturing industries. So we can bring those back. You can make cars again in Australia. So the two reasons you couldn't build cars here were, one, because of energy costs, and two, because of labour costs. A lot of the labour cost is now gone because a lot of it's automated, and the energy cost can be almost zero if we have excess renewables. So the ability to transform our economy is an economic argument, and there is no reason to hold that back. There's just simply no reason. So if we want Australia and to be a really wealthy nation and to use our natural resources, being the sun, the wind and elsewhere, and make green hydrogen, we can be a world leader in this, and we can, you know, in the past we decided we wanted to be a leader in coal, so we built a coal industry. Then we decided we want to be a leader in LNG, so we built an LNG industry. Now we can be a leader in exporting renewable power, so why wouldn't we invest in that industry? And the cost of doing that, as Kat says, are almost free. So if you put everything else aside, this is about the ability to transform Australia's economy for future generations, and that's what's so important about it. So I would say the core of all this, which we always forget, is one, the science, and two, the economics.
Hi Sophie, my name is Wendy Harbour and I'm here doing a bit of work for crikey.com tonight. And, thank you. I would like to ask you a question tonight, and thank you for putting together this fantastic panel. And I mean, so much blue sky here, and it's just wonderful to hear locals as well who really know our area. That's really wonderful. Bernard Keane wrote today or yesterday in Crikey about, and I hope you don't mind me broadening this out a bit, about when we vote for an independent, who are we voting for? He says that the press at the moment can't really differentiate between an independent and a political party, and he also talks about the connection between the Voices of group and the independents, and also, of course, Simon Holmes' Court group. Would you mind telling us about when we vote for you, who are we voting for? Are we voting for Sophie as an independent? Are we voting for a broader group? Just what are we going to get for our buck, as it were?
Thanks, Wendy, very much. I think if you vote for me, you're voting for yourselves, basically, because when we did do the Voices group and we asked people what they wanted in their representative, and I didn't for a minute imagine that person was me, but what people wanted was somebody who would listen to them, who would actually communicate with them and collaborate and consult with them. And they wanted somebody as well who would view the role as one of service, not some sort of career path to power and privilege. And so that's what you're getting. I think as a doctor for the last 20 years, I have tried to look after this community and I've tried to advocate for this community, and I feel it's a step up from that. It's taking it to the next level. I did want to just mention as well the health imperative for acting on climate change. One of the things that has motivated me, not only as a mother but as a doctor, as a GP, is every day I was working hard to improve the health and the well-being of people in my community. That's my job. And I have a wonderful relationship with my patients. But I had this awful sort of sense that there was this thing looming up behind that we were ignoring, that actually, as the WHO has said, the World Health Organization is the greatest threat to human health. So as a doctor, I need to get action on that. I need to do that on behalf of my community. So that's one of the imperatives as well, to act. Yeah, so hopefully, Wendy, that's answered your question. I think there was a question in there as well about climate change. I'm sorry.
No, I also was wondering, Sophie, as an independent and as someone who's not been part of a party structure, how will you be able to gauge what we, the community, think on any issue? What's the mechanism that you put in place so you have that feedback from us that will then guide your vote?
Fantastic question. That's wonderful. I'll give it a clap. I think it's a very good question. Look, that is an extraordinary question, and I think we have to look at what's happened in Indi, where the first community independent was in, Kathy McGowan, and now Helen Haynes has taken over the baton from that, and also next door what happens in Warringah as well and with other independents. I'll just talk about Helen Haynes though and the model down there. What she does, and Kathy did this as well, if people are coming to her with a problem, and there's lots of people coming with that same problem, she says, that's great, we can address this, but what I want you to do is to form a group and I want you to come up with a solution. And then I'll take you to Canberra to meet the minister and you can present that solution. So that's one way, those constituent advisory bodies. Then there's also town halls. Like I said, it's all about communication and continuing to communicate. So when there's a vote on, an independent, every time there's a bill or a piece of legislation, the independent needs to research it and make a decision on it and vote on it. So I can come back to the community and ask, how would you like me to vote on this? If you're a backbencher or part of a party, you wear a pager which tells you when a vote is on and how to vote. It was so extraordinary. Zali tells a story that when Craig Kelly went from the Liberal Party or the Coalition to the crossbench, on the first vote, he looked around and said, well, who tells you how to vote? And they all went, he didn't have his pager. But the other really interesting concept is this idea that I have to look into further, because it is a question that I ask myself, how do I genuinely represent this community? Because it's obviously we need to get a sample. And one way you can do that is through citizen democracy or citizen juries as well. So you randomly select a certain number of people, they get educated, they get informed both sides of the story and they come up with a solution or how they would like to vote. And apparently it's incredibly powerful. So that's something to look into further as well. Thanks, Wendy.
Hi, up the back here. It's a technical question, really. Every time I sort of argue, or not argue, just discuss sort of climate change and, moving towards a better future, you get arguments like base power thrown at you. And I understand that it's an issue. And the sort of what I was going to ask the engineering side of the panel is, how close are we to fixing that? What are the ways we're going to use to do that? And the other thing was on the ABC recently, I heard about home solar causing a lot of problems for the network, for the system. And how can that be controlled so that you don't get those overloads? And, it's an argument when you're trying to sort of just discuss with clients and people I work with and get over the feeling that climate change is real and that the science is real. And, I think the disrespect for scientists is shocking. What arguments could I just simply use to make people think a bit that base power isn't everything, or that it can be overcome quite simply?
Sure. So I think you're right. The scientists haven't been listened to, but nor have the engineers or the economists very effectively. And I think we need to be speaking up more to counteract these arguments, because actually, and we did talk about misinformation, but particularly on social media, there has been a lot of masked misinformation around the reliability of renewable energy and the cost reductions that you get from renewable energy. So it is true that wind and solar are not always available, but the combination of wind, solar, hydro, and storage solutions can and already has been proven to be 100% available in South Australia, for instance, and will be across the country. I sit on the New South Wales Net Zero Emissions Board, similar to the Victorian board, I would say somewhat more ambitious, although not legislated, but it's not a competition. It's not your turn, Roger. And so there are many sectors where we need to find the best technical solution. So yes, we do need to invest in lots of transmission upgrades and infrastructure. We do need to invest heavily in batteries. and renewables, and a mixture of microgrids and community opportunities, which there are and have come out of this electorate as well as utility scale opportunities. But all of that is the economic way to go. So to the point before, we are transitioning anyway because these coal-fired power stations will be closing down. So we have to put something up. And what is the most economic thing to put up? It is renewables with battery backup. And it's the same in your home. It's the same problem that many of us are having now. A lot of us have solar. We'd like to be 100% renewables. When the price of batteries becomes at parity, we will do that. And we'll have electric vehicles like you do, Sophie, with bi-directional inverters, which will drive around, and there'll be moving batteries for the community. So it is all coming. It's not all here today, but it will be within the time frame that we need to. And Australia is really leading the way on that. So it's an exciting time. And I just wanted to also add personally, Sophie, to your you standing as an independent and to your story, Greg, as well. I feel like an American. I've never been politically excited before in my whole life. Really, to be honest. I've never felt like our electorate, and I know, people particularly in Melbourne and other seats feel like their voices could count. I've never felt like that. And it's just the most exciting feeling to feel like we can participate in a future where we can have an independent that reflects our voices, but also holds whatever government to account for integrity, importantly, and for climate and for all of these issues that we all really deeply care about. So thank you. It's really exciting.
I just want to, if you're having these arguments, so one of the biggest baseload generators of energy in Australia is renewables. It's snowy hydro, and they're expanding it. The federal government is expanding it. In New Zealand, over 75–80% of the energy is from renewables. That's base power. So every country is different. Every country has different resources. New Zealand has hydro. We have pumped hydro, and we're pumping water back up, and we're using solar and stuff to do that. So we have sun, which can make us incredibly renewable. So the baseload power issue is simply not. We have to have baseload power, yes, but we have that. We're going to get that from. We already have it from snowy. We're going to get it from other sources. And as Kat said, we don't have a choice because AGL is just. Origin just announced it's closing Eraring early, and AGL is doing the same. But the other thing to also say, and when people say to you, well, it's really complicated and solar is playing with the system. It's true. We are going through an energy transition, and it's really challenging. And all these solar panels on all these roofs, which are putting intermittent power into a stable grid, is making it unstable. But that's why there's all these new technologies. That's why AEMO and the regulator are all doing all these trials and all these incredible internet solutions to manage the network. And we're going through an evolution of our energy system. And so that evolution is driven by investors, it's driven by energy companies, it's driven by technologies. And so, yeah, it's fair to say to people, yes, we are going through a transition, and yes, it is difficult, but we're coming out the other side, and that's where everyone's headed.
We've got time for one more question. Has anyone else got a question? I just have a simple question. How long do we have?
There's lots of... look, the Paris Agreement and the international community have set a goal of trying to limit the global temperature rise to 2 degrees, but please get to 1.5 degrees as best we can. If we do nothing, we're tracking at 4 degrees. Sorry, is that better? So under the Paris Agreement, which the international community have agreed to, including Australia, which is signatory, the objective is to try to stabilise global temperature increase to 2 degrees. But basically it says we've really got to get it down to 1.5. At the moment, if we do everything possible, we might get to 1.6, but we're tracking at 4. That is a terrible outcome for the planet. It's a terrible outcome for us and for our children. So if you started off saying the reason you did this is for our kids, and my kids say what they say to you, which is that we stuffed this up and we're going to have to fix it. So the truth of the matter is climate change is now built into the system. These events are going to happen. As Greg has talked a lot about tonight, these bushfires are going to get worse and they're going to happen. These floods, the floods which we keep hearing about in Lismore, which were 1 in 1,000-year floods, 1 in 100-year floods, which are now happening every 3 years, these are going to keep happening. It's built into the system. So we're going to have to adapt to climate change. We're going to have to redo the way in which we run our economy to adapt to that. But there is if we do all the stuff that we've been talking about tonight, we can get down to 1.6 and we can limit the global temperature rise to that and minimise the impact on the planet. So, how long do we have? We have our lifetimes, we have our children's lifetime, we have all these lifetimes to keep going. The question really is, what sort of life do we want to lead? Do we want to leave one that's highly compromised because of climate change and all the health impacts? And I must say, on your point, Sophie, the one thing that has struck me on the Victorian panel, on the public consultations we're having, is the number of health professionals who are coming forward saying the impact on health is absolutely horrific. So I would just say, really, it's not so much a question of how much time we've got to do a climate change, just how much time have we got to reverse the trend of uncontrolled emissions. And we now need to have people like Sophie and others in power who can help argue the case to get good policy to bring those emissions down as fast as possible.
So just to put a bit of colour to the urgency, even with the abysmal targets that the federal government have, take for instance transport, we need to not sell another ICE or non-electric or hybrid vehicle ever again from today if we're going to meet those targets, basically, or the targets that will ensure that we don't have a climate catastrophe. And similarly across all of our emitting sectors, we are behind the sort of exponential curve that we have to rapidly run up to or down, depending on which way you look at the graphs, to meet these targets is really frightening.
I've got to buy into this one. How long have we got? 6 weeks, mate. And look, yeah, that was a joke. But look around. When I was in California in October 2019 for the Kincaid fire in Sonoma County, and I then went and saw Professor Chris Field at Stanford University, and what he told me really chilled me. He said he's a renowned climate scientist. You know Chris Field? He probably knows Chris Field. He knows everyone. And he said, yeah, it's getting warmer. It's our fault. There's no question. It's human burning of coal, oil and gas that's created the CO2. It's getting warmer. And he said Mother Nature's using fire as a tool to turn forests into scrubland into grassland, grassland into desert. And if we keep going this way, and he explained how sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, parts of Australia, California will be uninhabitable by human beings because it'll be too hot and often too humid and unsurvivable. We won't be able to grow food where we used to grow it. And what I've observed in the years I've been to California since '95, bark beetles killing forests. They're just dying off because less snowpack, because they don't get the snow they used to, so it doesn't kill the beetles in winter. So they keep boring into the trees, they die, the fuel loads go up. It's happening in Kosciuszko. I was there as a National Parks volunteer a couple of months ago, and the fire scars, mountain ash trees are gone forever in some parts because they need 30 years between fires to regenerate. But we've had fire after fire after fire, and the last one just killed them. And the river, the snow gums are dying because there's a beetle with a really long name, and I can't remember it. It's not western bark beetle like in California. I had no idea. Same thing. They live year round and they're killing the trees now. So the forests are dying up there because of climate change. So this is urgent, and our government needs to recognise that the Great Barrier Reef is dying, our forests are dying, and we might die if we don't get our act together.
Hi panel, I'm Tim Maguire, I'm a resident of Cromer, just down the road from Greg actually. I've got a comment before I have my big question. I was watching CNN News the other night, and they had an interesting report, which was a global air quality report. And they went through the laundry list of the usual capital cities around the world that you see with an air quality index rating. And it suddenly occurred to me, if at the end of the renewable evolution and revolution, we won't need that anymore because there'll be no more fossil fuel pollution in the atmosphere. So that's the reason to be hopeful. But my question is, whenever we're out there talking to the community, you get two objections from a lot of people. One is a ridiculous one, that solar panels are not recyclable, and the other one is, but China. What does the panel think of those two ridiculous comments?
Before I answer that, I just want to tell one quick story. So back in, I think, in 2010, and Greg will correct me, Greg and I were on the New South Wales Climate Change panel. And Greg came in, I don't know if you remember this, Greg was on the panel as the fire commissioner at the time and said, we've been fighting fires in 40-degree heat. And we've been doing it for a long time. We sort of know how to do that. But last weekend, it was 45 degrees and the fires did things that we've never seen before. They just jumped and stuff was self-combustion. This is 12 years ago, right? We were seeing changes that long ago. And so I always remembered that story you told us that day. And as the panel was sitting here thinking about, advising the government what to do. So on those two issues that you raised, one, solar panels, it is a problem. They haven't cracked, until now, they haven't really cracked recycling. There are a number of recyclers in the world who are starting to do that. They're also now building solar panels so they are recyclable. But it is fair to say it has been a problem. And so in Australia now, there are people who are emerging who are setting up recycling companies for solar panels and for wind as well. So my answer to that question would be, if someone asks you that question, you're absolutely right. It has been a problem. The problem is now being addressed and there are people who are dealing with it. China is, on China, and the answer is also relatively simple. China is one of the leaders in renewable energy in the world. They're making more renewable energy in the world than many other countries. They are investing heavily in building renewables, and they have been for a long time. A lot of the solar panels, the batteries all come from China. And China has very aggressive policies on renewables, and it has the world's largest emissions trading scheme. So it is very, very progressive. The one thing you need to remember is that countries like China and India, two things. One is that they will argue they have a right to provide electricity to their people, and they haven't been able to afford large-scale renewables till now, but the rate of renewables growth in those countries is far quicker than in Australia. So I was in a meeting probably 5 years ago with a large coal company in Australia that was trying to defend that, running that argument that in India they've got 50 coal power stations on the list to build, and therefore they're not doing anything serious. Of those 50, 2 have been built, 48 have been scrapped. And it's in those economies, a lot of it is we have to provide power to our people. And yes, we're going to keep supplying coal and gas, but we're also going to heavily invest in renewables. And it's sort of a bit of a race. And as the renewables overtake the coal and the gas, then they become the dominant power source. And so it is just a transition. And those countries will transition slower than we probably can, but that's partly a right to energy access issue. But again, people forget China has the world's biggest emissions trading scheme in the world, and it's enormous. And all those major corporates are under obligations to reduce emissions.
Because you raised India. So some people here know I lived and worked in India for 4 years, helping in 2 businesses. One built more wind in India than all companies combined in Australia in the same period. And what I saw working there was the incredible uptake of renewables, even in a developing country. At the same time, I was working, I co-founded a solar business that was providing solar for people who lived in slums in India. And those people lived on less than $2 a day, usually less than $1 a day was our average customer. And it was still better off for them to, like many of us, to install solar than to use the kerosene lanterns that they were using in their house, which, to our point of pollution, was the equivalent of 2 packs of cigarettes a day. It's like them having, a coal-fired power station right next door. And what we were able to prove there was that some of the poorest people in the world, living in some of the biggest slums that you've probably seen on TV across India, could transition to renewable energy faster, certainly, than we could. And that, Australian company became sort of the biggest supplier of renewable energy to slums across India and now Nepal. And I think what we were trying to show there was that it doesn't really matter what your marginal income is, that renewable energy is a great option economically for everyone. And economic was the number one imperative for the people that we worked with in slums in India. So it is absolutely happening there from the slums to the utility level. As Martijn suggested, similarly in China, I mean, we haven't been flying much lately, but take a flight over China and it looks like they've just scattered toothpicks across most of the landscape. There are so many wind farms. It's incredible. And they have the strongest policies in the world there. They also, one of China's first billionaires, Zhen Rongxi, was educated at UNSW as a photovoltaic engineer and was their first solar billionaire. He was our graduate with our brains that he, used over there because they recognized the value of that technology. So, yes, it's going to take them longer, and they're starting from a lower socioeconomic base, but they're also really leading, and we need to be watching all of the nations around us, and particularly immediately above us, and assisting them with their transition and vice versa.
Hello, I'm Natalie Isaacs. I live in Newport, and Sophie, I just want to echo what Kat was saying, and I have watched your journey, and thank you so much for stepping into your agency and for doing this. And I have one call to action to everybody here. I don't know, there's 300 of us here. We need to be talking about climate. We need to have these conversations over the next couple of weeks, 5 conversations with other people in our electorate about this election and why we need to vote for climate action and why we need to vote for somebody who will genuinely represent us. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for everything that you do too. It's been extraordinary. Also, I learnt about 1 million women years ago, 10 years ago, and thank you for founding that. It's been incredible. And thank you. I think that's a great place to wrap up the discussion. Greg, Kat and Martijn, I can't thank you enough. It's been so informative and actually really exciting to have that hope and realise that, the technologies are there ready for the taking. One thing I'll just wrap up to say is that in answer to your question, like Greg said, there's 5 weeks until the election, and this will be the most critical election of our time. The IPCC has said basically it's almost our last chance to get a livable future. We need to get Australia back on track, and we need to do that for the sake of ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, and all future generations. We've heard that the technologies exist, but we need the political leadership. So in a few weeks, you get to choose what type of future you want. A couple of weeks ago, I happened to stumble across JFK's speech when he talked about going to the moon and why America was choosing to go to the moon. And I thought I would just read something about it at the moment. 1962, why go to the moon? We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organise and measure the best of our energies and skills. And because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. So I would just end by saying that the future is ours to choose. So thank you all for coming along tonight.